Welcome back to Icon Designs. In today's video, I'll be going through the steps that I took to build this custom corner office desk for a client who just went through an office renovation. Let's get after it. I decided to use SketchUp to get a feel for how this desk was going to fill the space. Now, I'm not an expert at SketchUp by any means, but I was able to get some of the core elements of the room captured within SketchUp, which helps you collaborate more effectively with the client on how big do you want things to be, what are some of the design features, and how does it work within the space. One of the examples that comes to mind is after looking at the desk and the space, the client and I both agreed that the corners of the outside of the desk needed to be cut off so that nobody accidentally hit themselves while walking through that area. Once I had a better idea of how many board feet of lumber I needed, I headed down to my hardwood lumber yard and picked up some beautiful black walnut. I handpicked planks that had some nice grain features, but also had limited sapwood. I then began cutting each of the boards to approximate length, leaving each board a little bit longer and a little bit wider than I needed. I'm going to take some measures later on in the process to mill the boards down to the right width and the right length, but for now I'm just doing rough cuts to get the process started. With the rough cuts complete, I then lay all the boards out to get a feel for where certain grain patterns are going to be and to start to visualize what the end product is going to look like. I then take those boards over to my jointer to begin the milling process. The jointer is going to put two 90-degree surfaces on the board that I can then come back with a table saw and a planer to get each of the boards completely square. You'll notice for each of the boards, I first joint the face grain and then reference that face grain against the fence of the jointer to get a nice 90-degree edge on the edge grain of each of the boards. Now, because of the volume of wood that you're removing during the milling process, there are a ton of cuttings that get generated. So I actually have to stop and change out my dust collection bag before I can proceed ahead. Spoiler alert, this is not the only time I had to change out the bag for this particular desk. With the jointing complete, I then take the boards over to the table saw, and I'm referencing the newly flattened edge on each of the boards up against the fence of the table saw and ripping them to give me a nice parallel edge along the edge grain of each of the boards of walnut. I know that's kind of difficult to describe, but this is part of the process to make sure that all your boards are nice and parallel so that whenever you go to glue up the wood panel, everything fits together really nicely. The last step in this milling process is to go over to the thickness planer, and if you do this step once you've been to the jointer with the face grain of the board, the thickness planer will reference against that surfaced edge, and now you are left with boards that have 4 parallel sides. I then use my crosscut sled just to put a nice, fresh 90-degree edge on the end of my boards. I decide to use my crosscut sled versus my miter saw because I actually trust my crosscut sled more so than my miter saw. With all the cuts made, I then put the boards back together, and I'm really happy to see that there's no gaps in the seams and we are very close to being ready for glue up. One last thing I did was put a 45-degree cut on the edges of the 2 longer boards, which is going to create the inside seating area of the desk. We'll do this prior to the glue up. I'll be gluing up the panels in 2 different sections. I'm doing this because I don't have clamps long enough if I even wanted to, but also if you try to clamp too big of an area, sometimes you can get some deformation. So even in this smaller panel that I'm gluing up, you see me using some cawls just to make sure that the boards are nice and flat whenever the glue up occurs. I did the same thing for the other panel, making sure to take care that there was no gaps in the seams while the pressure was applied to the clamps, and that there was good even pressure applied across the entire panel. For this next part of the process, I had to get creative with how I was going to glue up the two halves of the panel. As I said earlier, I don't have clamps long enough to span the entire distance, so I started off by putting both halves of the panel on blocks and using a level to make sure that they were at the same elevation. I then used a combination of some shorter parallel clamps along with my longest bar clamps and using those in unison to create clamping pressure across the panel. I used a level throughout this process to ensure that I wasn't introducing any cupping or bowing throughout the gluing process. Once the panel had dried, I used my circular saw and a straight edge and some clamps to put a nice clean edge on the end of the desk. This is where I cut the table to the final length. Now, you'll see here that this particular cutoff has quite a bit of wood left in it, and if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll show you what I decided to do with that extra wood. To make the mitered cuts on the corners of the desk, I start off by tracing a line with my speed square, and then using a straight edge, some clamps, and my circular saw to then go and cut that mitered edge. You'll notice that I take 2 passes to cut through the walnut because this is nearly 2 inches thick, and you just get better results if you don't try to go all the way through with a single cut. I've repeated this process for the other corner and was left with 2 even mitered cuts on the outside edges of the table. With all the cutting complete, it was time to turn my attention towards the sanding process, and I'll be using some Abranet mesh style sanding paper, which is really good for dust removal because the openings in the sandpaper are big enough to suck most of the dust through your shop vac extension hose if you're using one. So I start out with 80 grit and transition up to 120 and then 150, then 180, and then all the way up to 220. You'll notice that I water pop in between each of the grits. The reason for that is when you water pop, the fibers of the wood swell, and it allows you to come back and knock down those swollen fibers, and the end product that you're left with is much smoother, and it produces a finer finish. So I'll water pop between each of the grits as I work my way through the sandpaper. One of the common issues you run into when working with walnut is you have some larger knots and sometimes some cracks that need to be filled with epoxy. Before I fill anything with epoxy, I generally go through with a chisel or even sometimes a screwdriver and try to remove as much of the soft wood and the bark as you can so that you've got some solid foundation for the epoxy to adhere to. So you see me here removing as much as I can, not trying to cut into the harder wood, but just removing the softer material prior to pouring any of the epoxy. The epoxy resin I'm using in this particular video is a 1-to-1 ratio epoxy. So you mix 1 part A to 1 part B. And I'll actually be using a little bit of coloring on this one. So I've got some black colored dye. Typically when you use coloring in epoxy, you can either use flakes or you can use colored dyes. And the product that I'm using today is a colored dye. And the reason why I'm coloring the epoxy is some of the holes are quite large and go all the way through the desk. And I don't want light coming through the desk. That's not really the look that I'm going for. So I'm going to color it a pretty dark black, which will look really nice once the table is finished and you've got more of the darker and amber tones coming through the wood. The black epoxy will blend in a lot more seamlessly once that happens. As an added personal feature to this desk, I'm going to be inlaying my client's initials into the desk. Now, I've done some inlaying before with bow ties on a recent table that I did, but I'm relatively inexperienced with this, but I did want to add a personal touch to the desk. Now, my client is actually multilingual, but his native tongue is Russian. So I'm going to be putting his initials of P and K in his native tongue's alphabet, which is the Cyrillic alphabet. So the first step is to cut out the letters, and I don't have a bandsaw, so you see me using a combination of my table saw as well as a handsaw to cut out the letters and begin the process. For those of you who've been watching my channel recently, you may know that I have a CNC coming in June, and I really wish I had it for this particular project because it would have made this whole process a whole bunch easier, but that didn't come in for another couple of weeks, so until then I'm going to have to continue doing things by hand. Now, to begin the inlaying process, I put some painter's tape down on the table, and then I put some painter's tape face up on the lettering so that I can put some CA glue down and get the letters temporarily stuck on the table. And in the next step, I'll be coming through with a scoring knife and actually tracing out the letters using the knife onto the table. Now, I'm using a larger square here just to make sure that the lettering is going to be completely parallel to the bottom edge of the table. Once that's aligned and that glue sets, I come through and I trace those letters. And in the next step, I'll be using a combination of a router and a chisel and a hammer to create the recess where these letters are eventually going to go. Now you'll notice that I'm freehanding the router, and that's really because I didn't have a easy way to use a straight edge to make some of these cuts. So I used a relatively small router bit and was very careful in removing 90% of the material that I could from each of the letters. And then I came back through with a chisel to get as close to the line as possible. In terms of complexity, I think it's fair to say that this is really at the limit of what my capabilities are as a woodworker. This is a skill set that I'm trying to develop, but the end product was by no means perfect, but there was a lot of effort put into it, and I hope the client appreciates the sentiment and the attempt at doing something unique and special so that he feels like it's his desk and it reminds him of home. Once the channels for the letters were cut, I then began mixing up a combination of some glue and some very fine sawdust from the walnut that I had been cutting. And this is a little trick that will help make your wood glue a little bit more brown and not quite so yellow and orange. So I use a combination of the glue and then just a rubber mallet to get those two letters seated in place. I then come back later and try to fill in those gaps with a little bit of extra glue just to make that seam a little bit less visible. Once those letters get a sufficient chance to dry, I come back through some 80 grit sandpaper and just start wearing it down to get it at the same level as the rest of the table. I wouldn't recommend using a hand plane in this particular instance because the sharp edges of the letters might cause the hand plane to catch. So I decided to go with a more conservative and time-consuming approach of just wearing it down with some sandpaper, making sure my final grit was what the rest of the table was finished at. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the assembly of the legs. I did a video a couple of weeks ago about another sit-stand desk where I went into more detail, but all I can say is that it came very well packed. The assembly probably takes 30 Allen key screws to put it all together, but what I do want to focus on is how the legs attach to the table, because one of my learnings from the last video was that wood screws are not strong enough for a table that's this heavy. So what you see me doing here is coming through and marking on the underside of the table where the threaded inserts need to go. So rather than relying on very flimsy wood screws to hold this heavy desktop in place, I'll be pre-drilling some countersunk holes and then filling them with some threaded inserts and some machine screws to hold this in place. Not only does it make a more finished look, but they're a whole lot stronger. And if you're going to take a piece of furniture like this from location to location as you move around, it will hold up a lot better to being assembled and disassembled multiple times. After countersinking all the holes, I come through with a little bit of CA glue on each of the threaded inserts and use an Allen key to tighten it in place. The CA glue gives it a little bit of lubrication as it's going in, but also once that glue sets, it makes sure that that threaded insert won't ever back out. Before applying the finish, Rubio Monaco recommends to clean the wood with some wood cleaner. Now, they have a branded product that they recommend, but it's essentially just mineral spirits. So I'm using mineral spirits here just to make sure that all the dust left over from sanding is removed and you're left with a nice clean surface. So the Rubio Monaco is a oil wax product that we're going to be using today. You mix it 3 parts oil to 1 part accelerator, and you apply it by using a plastic trowel to spread it across the surface of whatever it is that you're finishing. And you can either buff it off with a towel or you can use an electronic buffer. In my case, I'm going to be using a polisher that I have from some of the automotive detail work that I do. And I just put a nice clean pad on the underside, and it helps spread the Rubio Monaco across the entire surface and make sure that you've got really consistent uptake from all parts of the wood. Now, Rubio Monaco will tell you that you can't buff enough off, but you can leave too much on. So after this step, I take a towel and make sure that all the excess Rubio Monaco is removed. Now, this finish takes about 7 days to cure, but once it does cure, I can attest that it is very strong, very resilient to water damage, abrasion, and it just gives the wood a nice consistent sheen. The last thing to do to this table is to cut a hole for the cable grommet in the back of the table as requested by the client. Now, I'm using a template here made out of plywood, and the reason for that is I've had some pretty bad luck with some of these concentric bits that have a pilot bit and then a larger diameter cutter. They have a tendency to walk on you if you're not careful. So what I decided to do is cut out a hole in plywood and then clamp that to the surface so that the bit couldn't move laterally from side to side. And it took me a couple of attempts to get all the way through, but the end product looked pretty good. The desk was just a little bit too wide to fit in the back of my truck, so I hooked up my trailer to make sure that I could transport the desk safely. Once I was at the client's house, I moved the desk into the office that it was going to be installed in, and then started to assemble the remaining pieces of the legs. I don't have a whole lot of footage of the assembly because I was working solo, but it went together very easily thanks to the threaded inserts that were installed earlier in the build. Once the tabletop was attached to the legs, the next step was to attach all the electronics that power each of the legs. Now there's 3 electric motors on this, so I function tested every one of them to make sure that it was working correctly, and I was happy to see that it was. With all those checks done, I brought the client in to help set up the memory feature for the sitting position and the standing position. And his immediate reaction was just, he was blown away by the quality of the table, the feel of the wood, and he really appreciated the attention to detail by putting his initials into the table using Russian letters. I think it made him feel like this was his table, and he's one of these people that's been working from home quite a bit during the pandemic. So I know he's going to get a lot of use out of this, and I hope it serves him well for many years to come. Hey, remember that scrap cutoff that I told you about earlier in the video when I said stick around and I'll show you what I did with it? Well, off camera I did some cutting and gluing, and I turned that scrap piece into a ingrained butcher block cutting board. Now, that's not the biggest thing in the world, but this would be big enough to cut vegetables and kind of smaller fruits. And it just took that otherwise scrap piece of wood into something functional and useful. So I share that with you just to give you some ideas of things that you might do with your scraps. If you've got any good ideas, I'd like to hear them in the comment section below. So let me know some clever things to do with the leftover scraps from your project. That's going to be it for this video. I hope you learned something and maybe were inspired to do something in your own shop. So take care, and I'll see you on the next one.